I'm Elizabeth Blasius. I'm an architectural historian. I'm a writer, and I'm the co-founder of a new preservation firm in Chicago called Preservation Futures. We opened up shop in the Monadnock building last year, myself and my business partner, Jonathan Solomon. I'm going to include my email address and my social media handles at the end of this presentation. So please reach out if you have any questions or comments. I consider giving talks like this to in a public forum about preservation to be part of my job. I consider preservation to be a service-based field. So I'm very happy to be here talking to all of you about my work and also a history of preservation, some and a discussion on the policies and movements of the future. This presentation is sort of heavy on the past. I'm going to sort of start it by giving a quote by my a very good friend of mine and someone that I'm working with on a very important project, Pastor Kevin Anthony Ford, always says that the past can be used as a tool. So I'm going to kind of lead my presentation off with that. And I'm going to advance the slide. Let's see. Great, here we go. There are a lot of different definitions for historic preservation. I'm going to use historic preservation and preservation sort of interchangeably during this talk. This is my definition. It's really a multidisciplinary field, and it's probably the most multidisciplinary one in planning, in the study and care of the built environment. But it's also the most misunderstood, because anyone that's familiar with historic preservation knows that it kind of encompasses a lot of different things and approaches. It's not only the physical act of preserving buildings, but it's also all of the different bits that go along with it. So when people talk about preservation, they're really talking, not only about the physical act, but they're also talking about the research end, state laws, ordinances. So there's a lot of different ways that preservation can kind of be expressed. But this variance definitely creates some conflicts when preservationists or preservation has a public face. So we often find headlines like these, where the entities or the people doing the actual act of preservation are unclear. And the preservationists, who they are often muddles. So in the case of all of these headlines, it's unclear as far as whether the preservationist that's the subject of the headline is a neighbor that's just advocating for the preservation of a building, or someone that works at a state level that's advocating for preservation. So when I see a headline that notes preservationists are calling for something, whether it's good or bad, it often gives me pause, because architecture or architects or planning or planners are really never covered in this sort of general way. And I really feel like readers and the public deserve better. We're all smarter than this. Yet many of the practitioners of, okay. Hang on, one moment. Great, cool, okay. I will acknowledge that many practitioners of preservation have a tendency to consider preservation as sort of a one policy. It's a single issue. So there's a tendency for some preservationists to approach the work as only about historic architecture. And it's impossible for me to believe that there isn't any obstruction at all in preservation. It hasn't until recently really been considered anything but completely morally good. So a lot of preservationists like myself, who are more progressive, are really kind of looking to sort of undo this notion of preservation as a single issue thing. Preservation encompasses a lot more than many aspects of planning. It's laws and ordinances. It's people working outside of the laws and ordinances together to save a building. It has a technical aspect. It has a physical aspect, but it also has politics involved. And we really have to look no further than the James R. Thompson Center to see how those politics come into play. It also involves folks like me who have a degree in preservation and are paid to do it, but also people that have done the physical work of restoration and preservation, just because they're stewards of a historic place. There are also folks that go to bat for architectural heritage that have no formal training, and often these parties just all work together to perform an act of preservation. So I'm going to present a preservation or a history of preservation in Chicago, and it starts with Chicago's oldest house. This is the Henry B. Clark House. It's an 1836 Greek Revival balloon frame structure. It was built for hardware merchant Henry B. Clark, who is from New York, and for his family. The house originally sat at 16th and Michigan, but it was moved to 45th and Wabash in 1872 after it was purchased by John Crimes, who was a tailor. Crimes's granddaughters were both public school teachers, and they occupied the house until 1941, when it was sold to the St. Paul Church of God in Christ. And this is where the preservation movement in Chicago begins. It begins with Bishop Ford and the St. Paul Church of God in Christ. Bishop Ford is the man at front, sort of center, with the suit on. Bishop Ford and his son Charles Mason Ford and his grandson Kevin Anthony Ford, and then also the faith community of the St. Paul Church of God in Christ, which is in the Grand Crossing neighborhood. They spent 40 years caring for the house. So this is through slum clearance, highway construction. The Robert Taylor homes were built just to the west of the house. And that care was done, not just through carpenters that they found, that they would found in the Yellow Pages. They found and trained specialized laborers, specifically Black laborers, to care for the house. And that stewardship really allowed for the house to endure through a lot of the harmful planning actions of the mid-20th century. The St. Paul Church of God in Christ also advocated for the house's landmark status. They held birthday teas each year for the house, while also broadcasting and advocating for its history. So this is really the first instance of someone kind of really caring for a historic building in Chicago and then really amplifying its history. And I would like to note that the African-American press, particularly the Chicago Defender, was always a big advocate of telling this story. Also significant here's an additional slide of Charles Mason Ford, Pastor Kevin Anthony Ford, and the plaque that was placed on the Henry B. Clark House in 1937. And then also a number of images from the church itself. Also significant to the history of preservation in Chicago during this sort of same time period is the work of a dedicated group of tenants of the Mecca Flats. Mecca Flats was an 1891 apartment building. It was built for visitors of the Chicago's World Fair, and it's sort of a foundational building in terms of a particular vernacular type of architecture, the courtyard building. You can see that it has a very large central courtyard with apartments surrounding it. It had housed working class white Chicagoans at the turn of the 20th century. And about two decades afterwards, the Mecca Flats began housing working class Black residents. So through the 1920s and the 19-teens, the Mecca Flats would kind of emerge as an iconic location in jazz music. It was immortalized in Gwendolyn Brooks' work in the Mecca, and it was a very cosmopolitan sort of place for people in Bronzeville to live and to thrive. Yet, as that culture thrived around the Mecca Flats, the Armour Institute, which is the parent the parent school of what we know today to be the Illinois Institute of Technology, IIT, kind of began it began fearing for its life. So IIT, the Armour Institute, began buying up property in the area, including housing. And as they bought up property, they put no resources towards the care of that property, that housing. So this disinvestment led to a historic fight led by the tenants of Mecca Flats to preserve Mecca Flats. And this is sort of a group of tenants, another grassroots effort. Although it's not really expressly called a preservation effort, it is a preservation effort, with the tenants sort of working against IIT's eviction proceedings. They took the case all the way to the they took the case all the way to the state, but unfortunately, the building was demolished in 1952 for Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall at IIT. This advocacy effort could be disputed by folks saying that it's not a part of a preservation movement, but there was no such thing as the preservation movement in Chicago then. So in order to kind of prepare for a better future that focuses on equity, we need to reinterpret our past. So it's important to acknowledge these efforts. And here are the tenets. Yet the beginning of the preservation movement in Chicago is sort of popularly known as beginning in the 1960s with Richard Nickel, pictured on the left, and a wider group of architects, photographers, and scholars and their work to advocate for the Garrick Theater, built as the Schiller Theater, designed by Adler and Sullivan in 1891. And Richard Nickel, all of these advocates kind of knew how to work the system. They were also they knew how to talk to mayors, politicians. They also had the tools and the voices as white men to be heard by elected leaders. This effort also took place downtown and was very well publicized. And while it's important to know about the efforts of Richard Nickel and the folks that were interested in saving the Garrick Theater, it was demolished in 1961. It's also important to kind of see that there was a level of privilege given to these folks as they worked on their advocacy efforts. In the 1950s and 1960s, we begin to see ordinances regarding preservation, beginning with the formation of a commission on historical and architectural landmarks, which, you guessed it, was all white and all male. So we begin to see historic buildings in Chicago protected from demolition and significant alterations per ordinance. Some of these first landmarks were the Henry B. Clark House, the Glessner House, the Water Tower, a couple of buildings by Frank Lloyd Wright, and weirdly, the site of the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, which was only about 30 years old at the time. I'm not really sure who brought that to the commission, but it's a very weird addition. And the structure of our ordinances really haven't changed much since the 1960s. There have been some changes regarding how a property can opt out of landmarking, but really these sort of laws, just like many preservation laws, are kind of stuck in time. They're from the 1960s and 1950s. The commission was charged with carrying out a survey of historic buildings in Chicago, which did not happen, unfortunately, until the 1980s. In the early 1980s, 50th Ward Alderman Bernard Stone was the city council official that lobbied the hardest for a municipal survey. So the 50th Ward was the first ward to be surveyed, and this led to an effort called the Chicago Historic Resources Survey. It was a decades-long research effort, and it grouped buildings by color rating based on their age and their significance. So the highest color rating buildings were red and orange. They were nationally and significant nationally and citywide. Yellow buildings were buildings that were considered to be relatively unaltered, pre-1940s, and part of a concentration of significant buildings. Yellow-green buildings were pre-1940 buildings that exteriors were sort of covered with artificial siding, but were still part of a concentration of significant buildings, just like the yellow properties. Then there was also green properties that had been altered from their original condition, but were still sort of nominally important, and then purple and blue. Purple purple buildings were extensively altered, and blue buildings were all constructed after 1940. There are very few buildings that are constructed after 1940 on the Chicago Historic Resources Survey. Most of them have, were designed by significant architects like Mies van der Rohe, or already identified as historic. The Chicago Historic Resource Survey was kind of flawed from the start. It's the basis for Chicago's 2013 Demolition Delay Ordinance, which holds demolition permits for buildings that have a high level of significance. So only buildings that are red rated or orange rated. So kind of a small number of buildings. And while the Demolition Delay Ordinance was set up for the Department of Planning and Development to determine feasible alternatives for landmarking, the responsibility of advocating for alternatives to demolition has over time been on nonprofits like Landmarks Illinois, Preservation Chicago, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So really, it's just the responsibility has been taken away from the agency, and really just now is on the nonprofits, Chicago's historic preservation nonprofits. The Chicago Historic Resources Survey has a lot of, it has a lot of misses. The data has a lot of problems. It's at best 27 years old. It's at worst 39 years old. So, our priorities in terms of preservation have really changed since 1995, 1983, and the Historic Resources Survey does not reflect that. It also does not properly evaluate vernacular architecture. So it misses a lot of vernacular architecture that is really important in telling Chicago's story. It misses any building of mid-century cultural significance, including the Emmett Till and Mammy Till Mobley home, which is, one of our most important historic landmarks, one of our newer, more important historic landmarks in Chicago. The survey missed that. What else does it miss? A lot of stuff. From modernism, Harry Weiss, vernacular stuff across neighborhoods. 5/1s, our little Chicago-style dingbat, Liberty Baptist Church on King Drive. If there's a ton of stuff that the surveyors missed, or stuff that just was too new to be surveyed. Failures are a big part of the history of preservation in Chicago, but they always give us something to learn from. So the Loss of Prentice Women's Hospital, built in 1975 and designed by Bertrand Goldberg. This is my photo collage, a photo collage that I took from 2013 to 2014 as the building was being demolished and the floors were being demoed, and then it was just sort of, just demoed down to just a little nub of materials. The failure to save Prentice kind of gave preservationists an opportunity to view advocacy efforts with the more engaged lens. But then preservation efforts also fail because of powerful interests and also due to the will of the people. That will of the people is what caused the failure of the Pilsen Historic District. This was a top-down effort by the Department of Planning to landmark over 850 buildings in Pilsen. It was supposed to match a 2004 National Register district. It was along a series of residential and commercial corridors. And the effort failed because it was presented sort of as a single issue to the public. Although it did have incentives attached to it, those incentives weren't expressed in the public face. Really what the public got was that, the City Hall is now going to put particular stipulations on how you care for your buildings. But the efforts also didn't publicly recognize the level of preservation that the people of Pilsen, first the Bohemian and Eastern European immigrants, but later the Latino immigrants that were already practicing in the neighborhoods. So there's this de facto level of preservation that happens in communities like Pilsen that We have yet to figure out how to acknowledge, either with traditional landmarking practices or with new tools. And here's a preservation success, although it's sort of an unusual one. This is the James R. Thompson Center. If you don't know this building, I'm sorry. You should probably leave the rock that you were living under and visit the rest of us. Our work on the James R. Thompson Center, both as Preservation Futures, being sort of a partner in a larger advocacy group with Landmarks Illinois, Preservation Chicago, Docomomo Chicago, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We really tried to communicate the value of the building outside of how preservationists and architects saw the value of the building. It's not only this, incredibly important work of postmodernism, but it's also a transit hub, it's a place of protest and activism, and it's a public asset. It's a public asset. And if you've seen the renderings of the building, you likely know that calling this a success is provocative, because although the renderings can be a distraction, the building itself is saved, and that itself is a success. As Preservation Futures, we're in the process of listing the building on the National Register of Historic Places. And we also hope, as Preservation Futures, to engage the city of Chicago on municipal landmarking. I'm going to take this moment to sort of give you a breakdown on the difference between the National Register of Historic Places and local landmarking. Basically, a good rule of thumb is if a national agency is calling for historic preservation, that landmarking act doesn't have sort of a level of teeth. The National Register of Historic Places is our official list of our country's historic buildings, districts, sites, structures, and objects worthy of preservation. It's a fairly honorary distinction. It includes incentives, but it serves primarily as a planning tool for the federal government and sometimes local governments. It does not prevent demolition or significant alteration. So that's sort of the big thing in terms of National Register listing and local listing. Local listing really has the teeth to prevent demolition or significant alteration. I'm going to go to this slide. The National Trust for Historic Preservation put out a preservation priorities study last year that determined that less than 10% of designated, so this slide is wrong. My goodness, my apologies. So it should read less than 10% of National Register of Historic Places designations explicitly recognize the experience or contributions of women, people of color, and the LGBTQ community. So less than 10% of the over 90,000 resources on the National Register of Historic Places. So what did we do as Preservation Futures? We wanted to find out what the data was for local landmarks. It's about the same. So it's just as sad. So less than 10% of designated Chicago landmarks explicitly recognize the experience or contributions of women, people of color, and the LGBTQ community. There are 371 individual landmarks and 62 individual districts. And while there are landmarks that express the contributions of Chicago's women, there are no landmarks designed by women. There are a scant 40 that explicitly express the Black experience in Chicago. In terms of individual landmarks, there is one district that explicitly expresses the Black experience in Chicago. There's one landmark expressing the Asian American experience in Chicago, and two expressing the LGBTQ experience in Chicago. And then only one landmark expressing the Latino experience in Chicago, which was recently went through Chicago City Council. It is the Little Village Arch. Why are there so few? Well, preservation has historically focused on white histories. It has historically had white people doing the preserving. We also, demolished a great deal of historic sites, historic buildings that had an association with people of color. Preservation is also overly reliant on historic integrity. So the ability for a building to convey its history using its physical pieces, sometimes those physical pieces aren't exactly there, even though the building has a tremendous amount of cultural significance. And preservation generally is all of its laws and ordinances are really biased towards architectural significance. So anything that has a level of cultural significance, be it a vernacular building or a vernacular building or site, it's much harder to kind of work with the existing rules to get that listed. How can existing policies work better? The first step is staffing the Chicago Landmarks Division. We have a wonderful Chicago Landmarks Division staff and commission in Chicago, but they're bogged down by permit review as far as some of our larger districts. They're not able to be proactive or work on new policies or landmark more buildings. And in any municipality, in any planning division, historic preservation jobs are always the first to go. So we need more resources and more staff. And a lot of this starts with city council members advocating for more preservation funding. A bottom-up approach is absolutely important. As I mentioned, Pilsen was sort of a top-down approach to landmark a large collection of buildings that, and the community really didn't go for it. So landmarking must come from stewards themselves and folks in the community. Early coordination is also important, and existing incentives also can be enhanced. We have a public suggestion for landmarks each year. These public suggestions don't always lead to a landmarks nomination, but it would be really nice if DPD and the landmark staff kind of really took those to heart and really worked with some of those stewards in a more coordinated way to get the things that people want landmarked on our list of designated Chicago landmarks. How can Chicago preservation be more innovative? We can develop new tools. We're literally unlimited in terms of new tools. One of the most important things is to resurvey the city of Chicago for architectural and cultural resources. That Chicago Historic Resources Survey really just doesn't cut it in 2022. It's time to resurvey the city. It will really kind of give us more of a sense of what we have, what we have left, who the stewards are, and what kind of resources they need. Preservation incentives disproportionately support large-scale historic preservation projects, and they're often executed by entities that already have capital on hand. So we need new incentives for small-scale preservation projects for individual stewards. Not every preservation project is a multi-million-dollar preservation project. If you've followed the Adopt a Landmark grants that were given or just late last year, some of those grants are sort of on the smaller side, but they make a big difference in terms of the way that stewardship can continue to happen. In Chicago, we have a Department of Housing, we have a Department of the Environment. In terms of preservation, we barely engage with both of those, but preservation has a lot of common goals with housing and climate change mitigation. I want to leave you all with this slide of pictures from the St. Paul Church of God in Christ. Preservation Futures is working to rename the Henry B. Clark House to honor Bishop Lewis Henry Ford. So the new name of the Clark House will be the Henry B. Clark and Bishop Lewis Henry Ford House. This is more than just a name change. We're also calling for a policy change and a programming and exhibit change within the museum. And this is another way that preservation can be more innovative, by looking at what we've done previously with fresh eyes. So whose history is it that we're telling? Who gets to govern the stewardship? These are questions that we need to ask moving forward. And thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you for your interest. I'm Elizabeth Blasius, and here's my contact information, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. It was a great talk. Especially as in Chicago, and it's really cool to see how preservation has kind of come to the forefront of conversations the last few years. And even on TikTok, there's like a TikToker named Dilla Thompson, Six Figure Dilla, who sort of goes through like Chicago landmarks and stuff and gives tours. So really cool to see how preservation futures contributes to this movement. So now we're going to get started with our Q&A. Can go ahead with this first question here. So earlier in the presentation, you mentioned some architecture of the 1980s that was sort of at risk or being targeted for preservation. Are there any other architecture icons of the 1980s in Chicago that you see being worth sort of mobilizing for preservation?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. There's the many works by Helmut Jahn, who is the architect of the James R. Thompson Center. Also works by Stanley Tigerman, who worked extensively in Chicago. There's Stanley Tigerman buildings downtown, but then also in neighborhoods. And postmodern buildings really are sort of at the forefront in terms of an architectural style that preservationists really should be watching, because a lot of folks that are sort of my age or younger kind of really see that design style, and there's something that really resonates with them. So and it's also a building that a lot of these postmodern buildings and the folks that design them are still around. They have archives. They're alive. They can be interviewed. There are a lot of opportunities to engage directly with the folks that made them.
Definitely.
Thank you. Yeah. So next question, audience. When did this home, I think the Bishop Lewis Henry Ford home, become the quote unquote oldest house in Chicago? When did it start being called the oldest house in Chicago?
There is there are pieces of information kind of going back to the 1920s and 1930s that identify the Henry B. Clark House as one of Chicago's oldest. And then, of course, like as time marches on and buildings are demolished, it's the number of buildings that have a particular provenance as being the oldest kind of gets smaller and smaller. So it was really the 1920s, 1930s when it really started to be known as one of the oldest. But it was, from the time of its construction, it was sort of this, it was a very well-known house. It had a different architectural style than a lot of things in Chicago. So it was really kind of a tourist draw. It was one of the first buildings that people actually went to go see, even when it was sort of way out in the prairie at 16th and Michigan.
Really cool. So our next question from the audience. All right, so now that the architectural biennial has broadened its scope to include areas not in downtown locations, how can this impact preservation efforts citywide?
How can the biennial impact preservation efforts citywide? I can certainly speak on the concept at the last biennial, and its concept being the available city, and that concept sort of focusing on empty lots and vacant lots. And vacant lots do have they have a lot of potential. We have so many of them in Chicago, but we also have buildings that are underutilized. And I would hope that the next biennial would have some sort of a focus on existing buildings and their ability to help us meet our climate goals, meet our housing goals, there is, there's a tremendous amount of desire, I think, in Chicago to solve, particularly to house people by building new. But really, I think, and one of the things that we know about mitigating climate change is that we need to sort of stop producing all of this stuff. So we already have so many things within our existing environment that we can just utilize or repair, not replace. And I would really like to see an emphasis on that at the next biennial.
Nice. All right. Let's see. Has the city's Chicago Not in Chicago ad campaign PR team engaged at all with local preservationists or other organizations that have focuses that intersect with this work?
Nope. But I would like to make a joke about Chicago Not in Chicago. Chicago Not in Chicago is when I'm forced to go to Southeast Michigan to go visit my family.
All right. Well, as for us as tech people and data people, what can we do to help these efforts?
Gosh, it would be really nice to have preservation is a field that's focused on old things. It's focused on history. That doesn't mean that its data needs to be old. So I really think that there needs to be a complete sort of rethinking of what good preservation data is and how data exists. I mentioned the Chicago Historic Resources Survey. It just exists. It exists on a zoning map, but it also exists just, on a URL. And I think that there are other ways, especially since preservation is a part of it's a public service and people are interested in historic buildings. I think there's a lot of ways that preservation data can kind of live to really engage the public. But I think it really just takes resources, and it takes really some convincing of the old school preservationists or the preservation status quo or the establishment to really just engage with data.
Yeah, and it looks like kind of a related question as well. Then, what would you say is kind of the most important thing that we in this room, in this virtual room, could do to support the movement, especially those who are not homeowners?
People who are not homeowners are absolutely important. I am not a homeowner. I feel like I struggle regularly with people who show up to community meetings or a preservation nonprofit or even a neighborhood preservation group, and then they say, as a homeowner, and that sort of leads whatever they say next. Renters have a stock too. I think that the best way to kind of be someone in a community that maybe doesn't have isn't a stewardship in sort of the typical way is if you're interested in the way that the built environment is treated in your neighborhood. We really need to get some energy going within city council, within different wards, and with different aldermen in terms of how important preservation is and how preservation can really engage with our environment, with housing. So I would really just, it kind of just starts with speaking to your alderman and asking the alderman, how do you feel about demolition policies? Are you looking to, what is sort of the community engagement process when something is demolished or something is upzoned or downzoned? They're really important for constituents to know about. But I also think that sort of enough noise around those issues can kind of cause individual wards to look at preservation and demolition differently. And there'll be a ripple effect there in city council. So, the more older people that are interested in preservation and are interested in the value of historic buildings and vintage buildings, the more that we'll see broader policy change.
All right. So the next question we have here, given that there is a small percentage of buildings in Chicago that are marked as landmarks that were influenced by people of color, of women, and the LGBTQ community, what are some buildings that you're aware of that sort of fall into or in any of those categories that we should be aware of?
Just a few moments before we started, I saw that there is a demolition permit pulled for the Manhandler Saloon on Halsted Street. LGBTQ places of significance where gay folks and queer folks gathered, are like often not, they don't have architectural significance. They have cultural significance. So, I regret that there aren't a lot of systems in place to, the building is not on the Chicago Historic Resources Survey. It's not on anyone's radar currently. So I regret that there are a lot of places like that that really just, get demolished without a lot of fanfare. There is, one building on West Jackson that one standing building that has an association with the Black Panther Party in Chicago. Again, it has no color rating on the Chicago Historic Resources Survey. It's, there's very little existing sort of catches to, and although that building is not, it's not threatened, there are very few sort of catches if it was threatened with demolition. So, and, we have a survey that is so outdated. So how do we figure out how to protect what we have if we don't really know what we have? And also it just goes back to, as much as I love many of our preservation elders in Chicago, they are mostly white and mostly men. And that kind of reflects in the landmarks that we've designated.
Thank you. And I guess on that topic of the survey as well, somebody asked, are there cities that have done recent surveys that we could learn from? And what role can technology play in that?
Survey LA is a great project to look at. It was a municipal survey done by Los Angeles, and it was done mostly on, using new technology. So using smartphones, using tablets. So there's a lot of ways that a survey can kind of be done faster and cheaper than the way that the Chicago Historic Resources Survey was conducted. The Chicago Historic Resources Survey was just a bunch of surveyors driving around in a Chevelle and marking things off on a paper map with different colored pencils. So we don't have to do that in preservation. We have beautiful pieces of software. Regrid out of Detroit has developed an app, the Regrid app, that allows, in terms of a municipal survey, you can develop different drop-down menus. So it'd be very easy to kind of pick up, buildings based on style, based on construction type, and really get those going into a solid database. So really, I think technology would play a huge part in any new survey. And a new survey could also, just like any survey, there's preservation needs a public component. So there should be a level of crowdsourcing that happens and a level of community engagement that's very high and listens to a community's priorities.
Absolutely. So you have a couple more minutes for questions. So any last questions that you might have, please enter them in the chat. This is a question from our audience that just kind of asks you why you became a preservationist.
I make the joke all the time that I really don't have a lot of other interests besides old buildings. And my girlfriend and my business partner, my girlfriend Alex and my business partner Jonathan will both like co-sign on that. I grew up in a really boring suburb of Detroit, but my grandmother lived in the city of Detroit, within a village within the city of Detroit called Highland Park. And we would visit my grandmother, and Highland Park is, you know, what I understand now to be a disinvested community, but it had a lot of beautiful architecture. And I would, in visiting my grandmother, would sort of just look around and really have these questions in my head that when I came to Chicago and I sort of found that preservation was a career, that preservation could kind of solve these questions for me.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so maybe we have time for one more question here. Yeah, I guess one of the questions is, you know, also just thinking of starting your organization. What was kind of your experience with starting it in the midst of a pandemic, and how did the pandemic kind of impact starting the organization?
Preservation Futures has no fear. We started Preservation Futures out of our how much my business partner Jonathan Solomon and I just really felt fulfilled and engaged through our work with the Thompson Center. And we really feel like our business model is unique, and it's needed both during our pandemic reality and outside of it. We are there are a lot of other companies that do the type of preservation work that we do, listing things on the National Register, doing historic research, program planning, helping buildings get financial incentives. But we're really approaching it in a way that we see that there are a lot of stewards that don't have access to those resources. So we're really trying to reach those stewards, as opposed to projects that kind of come to us because of capitalism, or because they have very big pockets and millions of dollars to spend on a restoration. So we're really kind of looking to introduce a level of equity towards that part of preservation.
Okay, so I think we are at time, actually. So I want to thank you again, Elizabeth, for your engrossing presentation, the question and answer that we just went through. Yeah, so yeah, that concludes our Q&A. We do have a post Zoom, a post presentation Zoom that'll be dropped in the chat. Again, that's where we do our intros. Yes. And so our intros and breakout group pitches as well. So yeah, just go ahead and go to that link, and remember that our code of conduct does apply. All right. With that being said, again, thank you so much, Elizabeth. For the rest of you all watching, thank you, and go forth and hack.